Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us on today's Checkerboard Chat. I'm Dr. Kelly Vineyard, and I'm one of the nutritionists on the Equine Technical Solutions team at Purina Animal Nutrition. And I am really excited about our very special guest that we have today. And so I am here in my home office in Gainesville, Florida. And I want to introduce you to Dr. Frank Andrews, who is in his office in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Is that right, Dr. Andrews?
That's right, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Yeah, the great state of Louisiana, right?
There you go. Well, yeah, so Dr. Andrews is actually the section chief of the Large Animal Medicine Service there at the LSU Veterinary School. And Dr. Andrews has been there for about 12 years, and he has a special research interest in gastric health of horses, equine gastrointestinal disease. He also has research interests in other areas as well, endocrine diseases, neurologic diseases, etc. Dr. Andrews is one of those veterinarian researchers that if you're a scientist like me who have studied gastric health in horses, you see his name all over every paper that's out there that has to do with gastric ulcer disease in horses. He is a ubiquitous publisher. I can't even count up the number of journals and chapters and books that you've authored, Dr. Andrews. So we're just really pleased that you agreed to join us today and share your wisdom about managing gastric ulcers in horses.
Oh, thank you, Kelly. I'm happy to be here and virtually meet everybody, and hopefully we can answer everybody's questions on ulcer disease in horses.
Yeah, so one of the other great opportunities that you and I have had in the past is we got to work on some research together. Right. Back when we were developing the gastric support supplement Outlast, that's when I really first met you, I guess it was. I came down to LSU and we actually worked with you there in your lab and did a couple studies with your horses there in your research program using the Outlast. And then you also helped us with a field study that we'll talk about in a little bit with some very special horses based out of St. Louis, the Budweiser Clydesdales, that were some of our test subjects as well for the development of Outlast. So we've really enjoyed working with you in the past. And I know you kind of have a really long history. You came to LSU from Tennessee. You were at the vet school there. Can you tell us a little bit more about your history and how it is that you came to really kind of focus your research on gastric ulcers in horses?
Well, it was a bit of a happenstance. I was involved in muscle histochemistry as a graduate student and a graduate veterinarian at Washington State University. And then in my residency, I got involved in some muscle histochemistry. And then when my first faculty job was at the University of Tennessee, and we happened to develop a relationship with Astra Hessler, which is now Astra Pharmaceutical. They had a product called Losec or Prilosec, which that's the Prilosec OTC. And they happened to have a veterinarian at that time who was working with their lab animals. And he said, man, the horses, they'll get a real high dose of omeprazole or Prilosec. So maybe we can make some money. So they went and asked us if we could work on getting the FDA to approve what is now GastroGuard. So we started that in 1990. And then in 1999, it was approved by the FDA. So it took us 10 years.
Yeah.
To get that approved, and now GastroGuard is the number one and the only FDA approved treatment prevention of reoccurrence of in horses. So
right,
still the leader.
It's hard to believe that it was only in 1999 that omeprazole for horses came out on the market. I mean, it has really changed the lives of many horses since then, and that's really neat that you were involved from the very beginning of getting out to the market. So I see we have a lot of people joining us kind of from all over the country. It's great to see. We've got Aaron in Florida, like I am. We've got some New York and David from Illinois. So thanks, guys, for joining. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. We're going to jump right in and we're going to just start talking about horses and ulcers. And number one question I think we need to cover, Dr. Andrews, is why are horses so susceptible to gastric ulcers in the first place?
Well, it's related to the anatomy. They have what we call a compound stomach. So it has two regions. It has an esophageal region, which is actually an extension of the esophagus or the food tube. That lining, that white glistening lining, lines the first third of the stomach. And then they have the typical stomach, the glandular region, which is where the acid's produced and the mucus is produced, and a lot of the digestion of proteins occur. And that's the lower part of the stomach. And so when, if you can liken it to gastric reflux disease in people, a lot of people have reflux of acid up into their esophagus, and they get what they call GERDs or gastro reflux disease. If you liken that, the horse has that esophageal tissue in the stomach all the time. So in between feedings, they'll have acid that splashes up on that esophageal tissue. So it causes heartburn in the horses, especially when they're not being fed properly and being fasted long periods of time during, before competition. And that's why we really recommend that, horses before competition should be fed, to have a small amount. It's like eating a salad before you exercise. Have a light meal to make sure that stomach has feed in it and not just the acid just splashing up on that non-glandular mucosa. Recently, we have identified these glandular ulcers that occur in that lower part of the pink part of the stomach, and that those have been more problematic. They're more similar to inflammatory lesions and may not respond to the typical GastroGuard treatment and may need some other treatments, pharmaceutical treatments.
Right. So we have these kind of two different types of ulcers now that we're learning about that horses can have. And still, certainly the non-glandular ulcers is what most of us are kind of familiar with. When you're talking about like the heartburn in horses, a lot of people don't think of it that way, but it's a perfect description because most of us have felt heartburn before. And that's, it's not comfortable. And maybe that explains why horses get a little grouchy when they have ulcers. And that's kind of one of the signs, right? When, you might start wondering if your horse has an issue, if he's getting grouchy, pinning his ears when you're tacking him up, and especially under saddle, because of the way their stomach is, all that acid is sloshing as they're exercising. And then they've got pressure pushing in that stomach too. The horse was not designed to like keep that non-glandular portion completely free of acid exposure, right? Like there's going to be acid sloshing up there and inevitably.
Right. Yeah.
You pointed out about the little meal, right? That's kind of helped mitigate that.
Right. That's the big thing.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, horses have access to hay all the time and that they're fed appropriately and not fasted. We a lot of times we feed the horse on our schedule, and that can be a real issue. There's periods of time where they don't eat, which is nice. I mean, in the middle of the night, probably between 11 p.m. and 3 or 4 in the morning, the horse really doesn't eat a whole lot. But the rest of the time, the horse needs to have feed in front of it and eating, keep that stomach full to buffer the stomach contents.
That's right. I mean, they're always producing the acid, we've got to always, and that's how they have evolved, as grazing animals, and we need to mimic that as much as we can.
Yes.
So we kind of, now we've talked a little bit about the anatomy and why horses are susceptible, but what's the biggest problem with ulcers in horses? I mean, I mentioned behavior, and sometimes that can be a big problem, but what are some other kind of negative effects of gastric ulcers? What happens to the overall health of the horse?
So what we've been able to ascertain is that, poor performance is another thing. If you've in athletes that run marathons, they have this gastric reflux syndrome, and they really feel terrible when they're running. So we think the horse may experience that as well. And there has been at least one study that shows that poor performance is associated with gastric ulcers. But again, just that chronic pain and the chronic irritation there in the stomach can lead to a stressful environment, stressful issues for the horse, and just an overall poor behavior. Once the pain in the stomach, then their appetite decreases, and so then they start losing a bit of weight, and their hair coat gets more rough, and so all those things can manifest themselves from gastric ulcers. And we also think of ulcers as secondary to other issues too. So if you have maybe inflammation further on down the GI tract, or you have pain, things like that, it could manifest itself in ulcers in the stomach. So they could be secondary to another condition that's going on in that horse. So primary and secondary.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. And you mentioned a lot of these signs that you might see: a poor appetite, losing weight, poor body condition, dull coat, but some horses are just stoic, right? And sometimes they don't tell you as loudly as maybe some other horses would, but even things, there are maybe some other more subtle signs I know that we see. One of the things I like to point out is like teeth grinding. You don't hear that horses do that very often, but when I hear, and I don't know if you see it very often in your practice, but when you do, to me, that's a major sign there's some kind of stress or pain going on, typically grinding teeth. What about colic? Kind of like this kind of recurrent colic. Do you see that as also maybe a sign that you should check for ulcers?
Sure. And usually it's a very mild reoccurring colic, and that can be a sign of gastric ulcers. We typically, most of the colic that most of the colic horses that come into LSU, we will scope the horse to make sure that they don't have gastric ulcers. Because we want to be able to treat those, make the horse feel better. And then if they do go to surgery, we typically treat with the omeprazole after surgery because people are the same way. They have pain in their stomach, after surgery. So colic is one. Just the basic, if your horse is changing its behavior, it's been a wonderful horse, and then all of a sudden it starts, pinning its ears, and, their behavior starts changing, then be thinking about, gastric health as an issue.
Right, for sure.
Yeah.
So Mary has a really good question. How do we know that the horse has ulcers?
Well, yeah, that's it's difficult, but what we like to do, what we recommend is obviously the best thing to do is bring your horse in, see a veterinarian, and have the horse scoped to determine if you're seeing behavior changes, lack of appetite, maybe poor performance, rough hair coat, those typical vague signs that you see. Then bring the horse in and have it scoped. Now, that's easier said than done in some cases, because we have clients or veterinarians that don't have endoscopes. You have to have a 9-foot endoscope to go down into the stomach and have a look to see if your horse has ulcers. So if not, we do recommend on occasion to use omeprazole as a treatment, to test treatment. And it's kind of likened after the human physicians. If you go in and say, oh, dyspepsia, then your physician's not going to send you right to the gastroenterologist to be scoped. They're going to disappear for hopefully only 15 minutes, but they're going to find some new medication for ulcers, and they're going to give that to you for 7 to 14 days. And then you're going to call in, how am I doing? So see if your horse's behavior changed after 7 days of GastroGuard, 1 to 7 tubes. And if that looks like you're improving, your horse is improving, then go ahead and treat for the 28 days, and then have your horse scoped. Gives you a few weeks to find somebody with an endoscope that can, find out if your horse truly does have ulcers.
Right. And I think we might actually have a photo of what it looks like when you scope a horse. Maybe we can bring that up here. It's really cool as these endoscopes, go down. And I've watched Dr. Andrews do this on multiple horses when we were doing our trials with Outlast. And, this is a really nice clean stomach we're looking at here, right, Dr. Andrews? It's
Yep.
And then when the tissue is angry and has ulcers, you can see that really clearly as well. So yeah, the best way to diagnose ulcers is to visualize it. So tell us what we're looking at here. This is a little bit of a different view.
Right. So this is the actually the greater curvature of the stomach. So this is a large portion of the stomach. And you can see that esophageal tissue, that white glistening tissue, and that's part of the esophagus. It's down in the first part of the stomach, the first third. And then there's a line there. It's called the margo plicatus. So it separates. It's a thin layer of mucosa that separates the white glistening non-glandular mucosa from the pink glandular mucosa. And then that pink area is where the acids are produced, the mucus and the pepsin, and that's where digestion occurs. We think the stomach was designed really for a storage place, so you could fill it up, and then the horse, when the pasture was eaten down, then they would have food in their stomach, within 24 hours to find the new pasture.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that may be how the horse adapted to have that type of stomach. I always say, that when God created the horse, he made a mistake, but then he made the veterinarian to help the horse, and then he created people to take care of the horse and recognize when they needed help. So
well, there you go. Right. Well, we're getting quite a few questions about kind of moving on. So now we know the horse has ulcers. We talked about one treatment, omeprazole. Are there other treatments, medical treatments for ulcers that can be used as well?
Yeah, so the ulcers in the white glistening portion or the squamous mucosa are likely associated with acid. So acids. So use of omeprazole in those treatments, or GastriGuard, is the FDA approved product for that.
Gold standard. Yep.
Yeah, the gold standard. Absolutely. Now, the glandular ulcers we think are related to a loss of the protective mechanism. So there's less acid or less mucus secretion, less bicarbonate secretion, and maybe digestion with pepsin digest some of that mucosa. So we use coating agents like sucralfate, and then we also can add these synthetic prostaglandins. And these prostaglandins are kind of the chemicals that help secreting mucus and help decreasing the acid secretion. So those two, along with GastriGuard, are kind of newer medications that we're using now for these glandular ulcers, which can occur mainly not very much in thoroughbreds, quarter horses, but more in the warm bloods, the larger breeds and the draft breeds. So, and we saw, we see those in some of the draft breeds as well.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. And the way to know if your horse has either the non-glandular or glandular is with the scope, right? So again,
right. Absolutely.
You sort of know what you're dealing with, so then you can kind of treat it appropriately.
Right.
We're also getting some questions about now kind of moving on. So we've identified the ulcers, we've now treated them. Now what? How do we make sure that these ulcers don't come back? What do we feed these guys? How do we manage them? And that's where I get all excited. How do we feed horses with ulcers? But and you've definitely done a lot of work here. But we've already mentioned it. Don't let these horses fast, right? Let's try to keep them chewing and putting food in their stomach. That's a natural buffer. And basically, we're trying to kind of manage that gastric pH, and constant food does that. What else does it? And specifically, let's talk a little bit about hay. So you've got grass hay and alfalfa hay. And I know you've done some work, Dr. Andrews, on the specific benefits of alfalfa hay for horses with ulcers. Can you talk a little bit more about why that is?
Yeah, so the study that we did, and actually it was there was also a study out of Texas A&M that show the same thing, is that alfalfa hay, because it has a high protein concentration, and it has lots of calcium in it. So we call it the dietary Tums.
Yeah, nature's Tums.
That's right, the nature's Tums. That's right. So because of its high calcium concentration and high protein, it's actually a buffering agent. And so when you feed it, it buffers stomach contents. And we did show that in horses, the pH of the stomach, and that's the indicator of acid. So the higher the pH, the lower the acid concentration, and the pH went up in the horses that were on the alfalfa hay when we compared that to horses who were on the grass hay.
Which is a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, which is significant. And it was it lasted for about 5 hours after alfalfa hay meal. So we're we like to see alfalfa hay fed to horses with ulcers, and you can mix it with the grass hay or feed it alone. Some people don't like alfalfa hay in high quantities because it kind of makes the horse a little bit hyper.
Yeah,
I think
Mel brought up a good point. Sometimes if you feed them a lot of alfalfa, they can get fat.
Yes, right. It's very high in nutrition.
And that's a good kind of segue, because you're talking about mixing. So that mixing a little bit of alfalfa with grass works. So the other, talking about managing pH, obviously the other thing that we've kind of recently developed is the supplement Outlast. So, that is a dietary addition. It's not a forage, obviously, it's a supplement, but it sort of is intended to do a similar thing. The studies that we did with you guys at LSU, also show that we could raise gastric pH within, 2 hours significantly. And so that's really helpful for these horses that, are about to go, maybe you can't feed them a lot of alfalfa because they're obese. But you want this, the Outlast supplement isn't going to have a lot of extra calories. It's only about 200 grams in one serving. You can actually feed Outlast safely up to 8 times per day. Now, like feasibly, you'd be busy trying to do that. But like, say you're going to go to a horse show and you have, you want to give him a little snack before you go in the ring. Maybe you show him later in the afternoon, then he gets it with his meals, and then he gets it before he goes on his trailer. If you fed, a pound of alfalfa every time you needed a little support, sometimes that's not as feasible. So that's where using a supplement like Outlast can be really convenient, for owners, and to kind of get that same gastric buffering effect that we see with alfalfa. One of the other big things that I always like to remind people when you're feeding horses that are prone to ulcers, smaller meals instead of like 1 large meal or 2 large meals per day. And when I say smaller meals, I say 5 pounds or less. People don't really, some of these studies that have been done in horses that eat large meals, and that's related to ulcers, those are being fed, above 5 pounds a day. So anything less than that, I like, if you can keep it at 3 pound meals, that's really easy for the horse to digest. You're going to avoid starch overload to the hindgut. There's just a lot of positive benefits to small meals in horses. But if that's something that, and another way to make your meals smaller is to use fat added diets, because they're more energy dense. So you can kind of get more calories in a smaller volume. So fat and fiber added feeds, kind of like Purina Ultium would be a good example. Ultium Competition, Ultium Gastric Care would be a good example of that. Strategy Health Edge is a fat added, fiber added feed, all really appropriate for horses with ulcers, especially because they have Outlast built in the formula now. So not only are you getting the fat and fiber benefit, but you're also getting a little Outlast, or you're getting a full dose of Outlast in a 4 pound meal. All right. What else about, we have to mention pasture, Dr. Andrews. I think most of the studies you've done do have a correlation with like the less pasture a horse has access to, the more increased risk of gastric ulcers he has. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. we really recommend that if horses have ulcers, that they have as much time in the pasture as possible. And all the studies that have been done with risk factors have shown that horses that are brought, that are in the pasture have fewer ulcers. Now, you have to look at the quality of the pasture too.
Right.
So here in Louisiana, the quality of our pastures, especially during the winter, is not very good. So our horses actually have quite a few ulcers when they're in the pasture. So we've started supplementing them, and we have round bales that they eat as well. And we actually can improve the gastric health by bringing them in and feeding them on a regular schedule. And so if you have a horse that has ulcers and they're out in the pasture, they maybe have poor pasture grass, bringing them into the stall and feeding them on a regular basis can help. It's also good when you have lots of horses in a pasture and there's a lot of competition for feed, especially these large boarding stables. We see that horses, they're always fighting and trying to establish a pecking order.
Mm-hmm.
And so, bringing the horse in the stall and feeding the horse in the stall so it's not competing for feed and being stressed out, we find that's can reduce ulcer scores.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, and reducing mealtime stress and even other environmental stressors too. There's a lot of more information on this. Actually, on our Purina Horse website, we have an Outlast. We call it our Outlast landing page. We have something called the Equine Gastric Health Program. Yes, and if you go to feedoutlast.com, you can find this brochure. And it lists out management factors, risk factors, different changes you can make. I mean, we would be here for another hour if we went through everything. But it is, it's everybody's a little different in their management scenario. But if you're having some struggles, it might be good to review that and say, oh, that's something I could try, and maybe it will help your situation. So before we wrap up today, I did want to kind of end up, and we've mentioned Outlast a few times, and I wanted to talk a little bit about what it actually is. I mean, we've talked about that it's a buffer and it's a supplement, but a lot of people don't really know what it is, and it's what the beauty of Outlast is. It's a really simple formula. It is a marine derived calcium, or seaweed derived calcium. It comes from a special seaweed that's off the coast of Iceland, and it also in the pellet is what else than alfalfa. So we've combined some alfalfa with a seaweed derived calcium. But what makes that seaweed derived calcium and Outlast special is its special, I'm gonna put my hands up here, its special structure. It has a honeycomb structure, which increases the surface area of that compound and the mineral. And so that more area for the acid for it to neutralize that acid in the stomach. And that really is how it works so quickly and is so effective. And there are other versions of marine derived calcium on the market. You'll see them listed as calcite on a tag, but those are different. Those are not the same. This version of the honeycomb structure in Outlast, that's actually proprietary to Purina. That's why we came to you, Frank, when we first got a hold of it. We said, let's test this stuff. Let's make sure that it works. It does. And so now we are the only supplier in the US of the specific form of the marine derived calcium. And, we didn't talk a little bit about the second step of the research process with Outlast. We tested it in the lab with horses there at LSU. Then we took it to the field, and probably some of the most hardest working horses in America. we took it to the Budweiser Clydesdales, and you helped us with that as well. And we fed Outlast to a group of these horses that were traveling all over the country. And tell us a little bit just about the experience of working with these cool horses and getting to see them up close and personal. I love this picture. This is great.
Yeah, it was an amazing chance to visit with these horses, and they are huge. That's the one thing I was able to see, is that they are actually huge horses, and but they're very gentle to work with, and they all have their different personalities, of course. But in that study, we looked at the effect of Outlast in these horses that really, when you think about it, a lot of they're hitched, they're travel a lot, and they're worked and hitched on a regular basis when they do travel. And these horses are they're constantly being worked and being looked at and handled, and people just love the Clydesdales. And so we were able to actually determine that Outlast, when they were fed to horses, the ulcer scores stayed the same, regardless of whether they were traveling and working, as opposed to the control horses where the ulcer scores increased.
They got worse, right?
And was kind of interesting in the initial studies. The reason why we were asked to come out there is that they were spending about $68,000 a year on Gastricard.
Yeah.
And that speaks to Budweiser wanting to help those horses in their gastric. But one of the good things about that is that, or one of the things that I should emphasize, is that there are some of the Clydesdales that need to be on Gastricard all the time, because they're very susceptible to ulcers. And so there are some horses that are going to always have to be treated, just like some people always going to have to be treated. And, the supplements are basically for maintaining stomach health and not as a treatment for gastric ulcers or gastric inflammation or anything. So,
we definitely like to remind people of that. You have to always treat, and good point, always going to be some horses that they're probably going to thrive best when they're on, constant acid suppression therapy. They'll need that.
Right. Yeah. Just like people,
right.
Your physician puts you on, Prilosec OTC, and you're on that for the rest of your life. So, but it's just the way it goes, and we haven't really seen any long-term effects of, lowering the acid concentration in the stomach, whether it be Outlast or, Tums or Alfalfa hay, or the use of Gastricard. So it doesn't seem to be any long-term effects of, reducing the pH in the stomach. Now in foals, if you have foals, that there have been some studies that have showed that there's more diarrhea in the neonatal foals if you treat them with the antacids and the Gastricard, but nothing in the adult horse. So we feel pretty comfortable that it's safe to use these supplements that reduce acid secretion and protect the stomach. So stomach health is important, I think, to the horse.
Yeah, and actually that's one of Priscilla's question here was, is Outlast safe to feed to brood mares? And the answer would be yes. We're actually including Outlast in Ultium Growth and Ulmoline 200, Ulmoline 300. Those are all growth feeds. And we've done studies at our farm, long-term studies looking at, the safety of long-term feeding of Outlast. And we feel really confident that, yes, we tested that, and we feel confident that it's safe in all age horses. Outlast, you mentioned neonate foals and Gastricard, but as far as young foals with Outlast, we find that it's safe to use in any age horse. So that's kind of the nice thing about some of these supplements, a supplement like Outlast. Let's see, a couple other questions before we let you go. Let's see, we talked about diet. Someone's asking about stones, so calcium intake and bladder stones. I will say that depends. That's one of those questions, like if you, Carrie, why don't you send a message to us? We have some more questions. I would want to know what the diet is. From a nutritionist perspective, we do know that some of these urolists may have relationship to calcium, but usually it's extremely, extremely high levels of calcium. So the only way to know is to do a full ration analysis. And as a nutritionist, that's what I would do, is like calculate what you're feeding. Probably you're within good range, but you probably don't want to feed straight alfalfa to your horse. You eat 20 pounds of alfalfa a day. That gets to be a lot of calcium in the diet. But a little alfalfa is usually okay. So that's one of those questions. It's kind of maybe contact us offline and we can help you with that.
Yeah, I will say one thing. A lot of the bladder stones in horses are related to bladder infections, with bacteria.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to have the unitus there to get those stones formed. So if you have a horse that's poor conformation or issues, with bladder infections recurrent, then probably need to work with your veterinarian. But the only time we see the stones is when you have the bacterial infection in the bladder. So getting can really help with the decrease in the stone formation.
Yeah. And so, yeah, probably don't need to be too hung up on calcium intake for those horses.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks, Sandy, for your comment. Supporting Outlast 100%. We appreciate that. We have to thank Dr. Andrews for helping us get Outlast to the market a few years ago. We're continuing to see success with it as a part of a full gastric health program. It's not the panacea. Management is very important. Proper feeding practices is very important. Treating ulcers when necessary and working with your vet. That's also important, but we're really happy to have Outlast available as an effective way to kind of help mitigate these ulcers from coming back once you've dealt with them properly. So thanks again, Dr. Andrews, for joining us. I think that that wraps up our time together. Any final thoughts or any final comments you'd like to make?
Yeah, I'm really happy to work with you, Kelly, and Purina. One of the things I'll say about Purina is that they want to have science-based nutrition. So, having studies done. It's like, oh yeah, no, we're okay now. Your slide on the supplement choosing, how to choose a correct supplement, that RIDE. So I think that would be very helpful for people if they're trying to choose a supplement. Follow the research, see if there's some research done, and look at the ingredients to be sure you're not double dipping or triple dipping in ingredients, and then the dose, and of course the efficacy. The research should tell you if the product actually works. So, I think looking at that, using that acronym is excellent for choosing supplements. And remember, supplements should be used not to treat any diseases, but just to maintain gastric health. And always consult your veterinarian for the latest in the best treatments for gastric ulcers and other things as well.
Yes, well, very good final words to leave us with. Thanks for mentioning the RIDE acronym. That is definitely something that we like to talk about, because as horse owners are just kind of inundated with all of these supplements out there. And if you can just ask yourself a couple questions about, is there research behind this? Do the ingredients make sense and we're not doubling up? Is there enough in there to make a difference, a dose, and then efficacy? And do you see a difference in your horse? I mean, your horse is your final say, right?
Right.
Too. So thank you again for your time, and thank you everyone for joining us. If you have suggestions for future Checkerboard Chat topics, please let us know. Put them here in the chat, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much.